Alrighty, looks like we're waiting for folks to join. Our fourth day, I know we've had some familiar faces join us for the first 3 days, and you're probably used to my kind of buffering here as we get started at the beginning of our sessions, just welcoming everyone to our last day of our second annual Career Week hosted by LMK. Excited to be back with everyone. I will be one of your co-hosts today, which I'm excited about. I've kind of been in the moderator capacity. Although for those that have joined, I like to talk a bit. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more today and share my thoughts around the TMF space. So excited to welcome everyone to our last day, our last C of being a TMF professional in the TMF space. And today is really going to talk about culture, which I think is a culmination of a lot of the topics that we have talked about together over the last couple of days. So I have my final co-host today, Laurel Ann Schrader. I'll allow her to introduce herself to everyone. And then we'll kind of get started today. So Laurel Ann, can I have you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Laurel Ann Schrader. I am the Director of Client Solutions here at TransPerfect. I have been in the industry way too long. No, 24 years now, I think. Okay. All TMF, all specific to the TMF, starting in a closet with a red pen and paper to where we are now. Most of my career was with the sponsor side, but I have worked for CRO and obviously now the vendor.
Nice. Very cool. And then just to reintroduce myself to everyone, I know I've kind of been creeping on the side here, but Ben Rogers, Senior Manager of Education at LMK, been in the industry about 14 years. Most of that time has been on the CRO side. So, the battle between Laurel Ann and I over the years between sponsors and CROs. But we, in that 14 years, had various roles, started in paper as well, worked in electronic solutions, and in the last couple of years have led on the education side. So I joke and say, I think the joke's getting old. I've got to come up with a new one that, I'm a glutton for punishment because I like training and I like the TMF and everybody's least favorite things, right? Training and TMF. But excited to be here today to talk about culture surrounding the TMF. Is there a culture, right? That's something that we're going to explore. What does that actually mean? But I know this will be the last time I ask the question for the week. But, as a TMF professional in the TMF space, maybe some of your favorite things, like what keeps you in the TMF space? 24 years, right? I think starting 24 years ago, people probably didn't think there was a career in the TMF. So what's kept you here that long?
I would probably say the evolution of it, right? Yeah. If you think back to what, and I say in a closet, because that's literally what it was, with a stamp and having to, identify the document, put a stamp on it, file it. I am an organizational freak. As you can see, my desk is nice and clean. So seeing the organization from the paper side and evolving to the electronic side and seeing all the ins and outs, there's still things that scare me, sometimes I feel we evolve a little too fast, but I think that's probably the most exciting thing. And to look back and know that we touched the paper and we were part of that evolution, I think is probably the most exciting for me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, a lot of people may not see that evolution. And that's something we might talk about in the cultural aspect of things today, right? Is the TMF being viewed differently than it was 24 years ago when it was paper, and how we're using electronic solutions today? And, I've kind of shared throughout the week, I like the investigations that we do. A lot of people say, having that eye for detail as a TMF professional and being able to kind of look at those documents and inspect things. And, for me, I really like the problem solving that we're allowed to do. And I think a lot of people maybe don't think of the TMF space as problem solving, perhaps. Right. Whether that's, where do I file this document? What do I name this document? Or, configuration of systems, especially with these eTMF platforms. I think that all goes into kind of the evolution, as you said, from paper, because I think we said throughout the week, TMF was very reactionary years ago. We always responded to something. Oh, file this document, change this, move this around. And that culture has shifted. But as we go through today, I see some folks saying good morning, hello. Glad to see lots of engagement right here from the beginning. And as we go through, again, questions, comments, you've got folks with combined years of experience. We're totaling close to 40, which is kind of crazy to think. So please ask questions, remain engaged as we go through the topic today. We certainly welcome, kind of any questions as you go along. And if you've joined other sessions, you've probably seen we try to prioritize what you all are asking, because that's one of the big things and why we host these types of events. We want to see, what are your questions? What are your comments? What are you seeing in the space? and let's kind of dissect those. But of course, we have some topics that we want to talk about when it comes to culture. And I think we can kind of start with, where we have been, where we are. And we kind of started with that, saying back in the closet days when we were sitting in those file rooms with paper. But when we think about kind of the current culture, what are you seeing, Laurel, maybe within the industry? And we can think beyond just as TMF professionals, because we might have a different mindset. But in the industry, what do you think the current kind of climate and culture is surrounding the TMF? What are kind of the buzzwords, the big topics that you're seeing a lot of people really interested in?
I think the biggest thing I've heard, and you said buzzword, collaboration, and across the board. We tease, how many times you and I done this? We're like, CRO, sponsor, right? We're one team. We're coming in together to do it. But now seeing, again, going to evolution, right? We're now seeing the functional areas in a sponsor, wanting to dive in a little bit more, wanting to understand why is it so important. So I would say on a thought leadership side, I've probably been really, really in it for 4 years and really out there talking and going to conferences. And that seems to be, it's an ongoing, everyone, can you tell me how we get the functional areas involved?
Yeah.
And so now to lead panels and ask sponsors, how engaged are you? How, do you have the team? So to hear people really diving in now and really wanting to understand what their role is in an inspection is tremendously important, right? Because I've seen sponsors fall on their face because they didn't get the engagement from their teams. And then you're sitting, maybe you've got some data management plan or a case report form, and somebody in ClinOps is trying to explain the issues, right? Why is data management explaining the issues, or why isn't? So getting that engagement, I think, is probably the most exciting for me now. And to really hear, I know you guys talked about it earlier in the week as well, but getting that sponsor and CRO to collaborate, to be that one team, to be that unit. Because at the end of the day, yes, the sponsor is responsible for that TMF. But the CRO should have the utmost standards as well, right? And if a sponsor is not setting those expectations, CRO is going to do their role. Maybe it doesn't meet the sponsor's expectations, right? So you have to have that communication and collaboration across the board.
Yeah, I love that. And, one thing that you've mentioned here is sponsors having a little bit more ownership, right? And accountability. And we've known, it's kind of always been in regulatory guidance, right? That I always joke that if it's a multiple choice question and the answer is sponsor oversight, that's probably the answer, right?
Yeah.
Like they are ultimately responsible. But, what do you think has maybe in recent years driven that change of having sponsors take maybe more ownership of the TMF, whether that's implementing their own instance of a platform or creating their own platform? Do you think there's something driving that behind the scenes, like a primary driver? Or, what are you kind of hearing people say?
I absolutely do. I mean, I think it comes down to a lot of us in the industry, and especially those of us that are in the thought leadership side, right? We are always researching inspection findings. Always. The number one inspection finding for 2024 was sponsor oversight, or lack of sponsor oversight. So I think to have sponsors now see that, and you're seeing more, funny enough, you're seeing more CROs come to conferences, right? It used to just be sponsors, and now you're seeing more CROs get involved and want to have their voice heard.
Yeah.
So they'll tell you, right? CROs have been saying this for years. You guys need to be engaged more. You need to do this more. You need to do this. So now you're seeing it. Now you're seeing the inspection findings. You're seeing the issues that, resource limitations. You and I have talked about this 100 times. We don't have enough resources. Okay. But there's third parties out there that can help you do that oversight.
Yeah.
But you still have to touch it. You still have to understand your story. You still have to know that. And I think hearing it across the industry has kind of scared some sponsors and scared some people that they're like, all right, we really have to focus on that. We're working with a client currently right now who has no process whatsoever. They've solely referred to CRO's process and everything.
Yeah.
And they had a mock inspection recently. And they tanked it because not one person could talk about the TMF because they had no idea what they had never done a periodic review. Yeah. They assumed the CRO was doing that, which they did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they were doing their own check, right? The sponsor still has to get in there. So I think hearing the findings, we're seeing a lot more people on these webinars and at the summits just engaging. I remember going to my very first summit. I sat there like this and just listened. I didn't say anything. I just listened. And I got home and my squirrel was running around in my head and I had so many ideas and how we can improve. So funny enough, that was, oh my God, so many years ago. But I took cross-functional assistance and made it part of our plan at the last sponsor I worked at. Went to a summit, heard somebody talking and went, oh, that's kind of brilliant. Let's engage and let's get these people involved. And sure enough, by the time we had our inspection, the team knew what they were doing and they were ready. So engaging and getting people involved, I think, is important. I did see a question come over about explaining what kind of sponsor oversight.
Yeah.
Vendor management. You have to understand what your vendors are doing. CROs, IVRS, data management, whatever. You have to understand that. You have to have a good plan on that. You need to understand your documents.
Yep.
Don't rely on your CRO or your service provider fully, right? You absolutely can. But even if you engage in a third party and you have somebody doing those periodic checks for you, you need to go and hold them accountable. They're one of your vendors, right? So you need to be able to tell the story of why was this document sent in 3 months after it was signed, and why did it take 3 more months to get approved or finalized, right? You need to be able to tell your story. You're not going to be able to call in your vendor, your CRO, into your inspection. You need to be able to tell that story. So oversight is a bunch of different things, but for me, primarily it's knowing your story of your TMF, making sure you have that oversight over all of your vendors and your cross-functional teams. You need to hold them accountable as well. That would be I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
No, yeah, I agree there. And I think, it touches the culture and the change that we've seen of sponsors outsourcing, right? And a lot of times they would rely on CROs to manage the trial master file. And there may be some level of reporting, they might, the TMF team might attend the monthly meetings or the quarterly calls and provide updates. But was that information actually meaningful, right? As part of oversight, where is that documented that you understand the current status and the health of the trial master file? What information has been provided to you? Did you have follow-up on those actions, right? And I think years ago, sponsors were very heavily reliant on the CROs kind of just doing everything, and oversight was just kind of, I'm informed, right? But is that actually oversight? What are you doing with that information? Do you understand that information? So for me, oversight we're bridging that knowledge gap and understanding the purpose of the TMF, what's expected when it comes to regulatory expectations for completeness, timeliness, quality. Because as a sponsor, how do you enforce those expectations if you don't understand those expectations? And again, you may outsource your work to those experts at CROs or vendors or other third parties, and that is fine, but you shouldn't wash your hands of that and say, oh, I don't have any idea, what these expectations are. They'll tell me everything, because when you have those mock inspections or those actual audits and inspections, they're going to have expectations of you, and you should be able to answer questions about oversight. And they say, tell us how you've had oversight of the TMF and how are you collaborating with your vendor or with your CRO. And if your response is just like, oh, they do everything, they just report to us any issues, that's probably not going to be the response that they're really looking for. And so when you think about oversight activities, they can happen in many different forms. I think that is something to consider as well. Whether you're doing audits as a sponsor, whether you're doing quality reviews as a sponsor, metrics reporting, project status meetings, oversight can look different, and it can be a combination of efforts. And that is something that I commonly see as somebody's asking, like, essentially, what's the bare minimum? And that kind of leans into maybe the culture around the TMF as well. A lot of times is, what's the bare minimum effort I can put in to essentially get past these audits and inspections? And we kind of need to move beyond that, because we're going to continue to have these systemic issues of non-compliance with things like training, access issues, these little things that can be so easily resolved because we're just trying to do the absolute bare minimum there. So yeah, sponsor oversight happens in many different forms. The important thing is you have evidence of it. What you're doing is,
and don't be that sponsor that oh, I'm going to rely solely. Don't send me any of that information. Send it to the CRO. The CRO is responsible. I don't need to worry about process here, because the CRO is doing everything. Don't be that sponsor, because you will be that sponsor that goes, oh, I should have listened, right? You need to be more engaged in your TMF, more engaged in it. Get a team that's engaged in it. Like I said, we've got this one client and they don't want any metrics. They don't want to send us, they don't want us sending them anything. Yeah. They want us to identify to the CRO what's missing. Yeah. But you need to be aware. So.
Yeah. And it is tough because they're like, well, what are we paying these services for, right? If they're not going to do it. And it's like, I understand what you're saying. They're still accountable. They have to close these gaps, but don't you kind of want to know? Because if you're paying them all this money and the TMF is only 20% complete, do you really want to pay them 100% of what you owe them?
Right. Good grief.
I love it. One thing I wanted to kind of add is you talked about process, which I think is so important when we think about, culture and what that really means and, how we view the trial master file. And I think I mentioned this yesterday, and it's kind of this forced expectation that we put on people that I think needs to be there from a process perspective, because if you don't set expectations in your SOPs, in your contracts, in your plans, you don't have anything to hold those teams accountable to create that culture to fall back on. So it starts with aligning those expectations from the very beginning, in my opinion, having people train on the TMF SOPs, having functional lines train on the TMF plan so they're exposed to the expectations of the TMF and holding them accountable. And again, it looks different from every organization. Sometimes functional lines have more accountability when it comes to the TMF. Others, they have a little bit less. Maybe we have more resources. That's fine. You can create the culture within your organization of what each role does, but we have to hold them accountable to kind of that bare minimum standard is what I say oftentimes of like, if somebody's creating a document, the bare minimum is that they know the quality of the document and they get that document to the next step, right? In a timely manner. So how do those things happen? Your process has to define it, because otherwise people will just say, oh, it's not my responsibility, right? It becomes that culture of non-engagement, no accountability, because I don't have to. It's not required of me. So I think culture can be driven, by the process itself.
Absolutely. But, absolutely.
Yeah. And thinking about, just kind of culture in general and how we view the TMF. I'm curious of your opinion here, Laurel, if it has actually shifted. And so what I mean by that is, I would think, in my experience, people know about the TMF, right? They kind of understand the general purpose of the TMF. Like, we have all these documents. They need to go in this filing cabinet somewhere. They need to be in this electronic solution. But do you think we are seeing a shift, or at least a noticeable shift in the industry of actually leveraging the TMF as part of like quality and trial oversight? Or do you still think we're kind of on the back end of things of like, it's just kind of a repository? What are you seeing in conversations?
I've seen it both. I've heard it both. I think I've heard it more of for newer clients, right? Coming in or newer people that maybe I haven't spoke to on a regular basis that I'm meeting. We're now and this is from their perspective, we now understand the importance, and we now understand we need to do this, and this. And in my head, I'm like, how did you not know that before? But we still see larger pharma companies where TMF is not the priority. That's scary. Larger companies, not a priority. Where the smaller ones are so focused on quality and so focused on everything is in one system and it's one source, right? You and I say that all the time. Yes, you can have documentation in multiple places, but you should have your one source. It should be your primary. So we're still seeing that up in the air. The smaller companies jumping right into the culture, jumping right in. What do we need to do? Can we have a workshop where we engage data management, tell them exactly what their role is, what they need to understand, and what they're going to be responsible for? And then we'll have a mid to large pharma say, is it really important? And they still have it at the bottom of the agenda. I think you and I talked about this the last time about things that you can improve to improve your culture and make sure that TMF is at the top of your list. Put it at the top of your agenda. So when you get into a study meeting, we're going to talk about the TMF first, because how many times is it at the bottom and it always just gets shoved aside? It's never, meetings take over and we don't always get all that done. So we've changed, or we've shifted a little bit on our side as well, that when we're meeting with clients, we talk about quality reviews and their status of where they're at first, the metrics first, and then you can get all the nitty gritty after, because we want to show the importance of those metrics and them understanding that as well. I think it's going to take, I think we're going to be to the next level of evolution of the TMF before we get everybody on board, if that makes sense. There's still going to be those outliers. There's still companies out there that have everything in paper because that's what they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And they're allowed to, it's not against the rules.
It's not a standard that you have to have everything electronic. Yeah. What is becoming a standard though is the structure. And one of the things I like to talk about and think about is how that TMF reference model started and where it's come and how it's becoming a standard. But that awesome column that says responsible party, now you're really telling your team members you're responsible for this zone, these documents. So they started to set that stage for culture years and years ago, right? Yeah. And now it is becoming a standard. And I think we're going to see it change again. When version 4 comes out, I think we're going to see some shifts there as well. You just have to be. We have to be as vocal as we can, as experts, as those that are in the industry doing it every day. You have to be vocal about it and share your concerns. Ask questions. Yeah. If you're not comfortable with that, ask a question. Yeah. That's what
I agree. And yeah, you just mentioning asking questions. I know we've got a lot of folks. We got a couple questions come in. We've got the folks saying good morning, hello. Just want to be mindful of those that maybe joined a little bit later. Please ask those questions. Stay engaged. If there are things that you want to Laurel and I to discuss regarding culture, things you're curious about. If we mention topics like version 4 of the reference model, and you kind of want to know more, it's in development, so there's only so much that we know. Yeah. So you're curious. We can kind of give those buzzwords and kind of talk about those conversations. But something that's been interesting to me that I have seen is ETMF's been around for a while, right? They're not like something that's new, but with, COVID coming around, we've seen a lot more adoption and implementation, I think, especially on the sponsor side, kind of bringing things in-house, and other electronic systems in clinical trials, whether that's like safety, data management, CTMS, they've existed for years as well. And I think in paper formats, people kind of understood that kind of single source of truth as, oh, I need to print this document, send it into the TMF, right? But I think we've seen maybe a reversal in some ways with these electronic solutions, especially as more and more vendors offer these suites of solutions. So you have like the EDC, the CTMS, the startup, the TMF, kind of all under this one vendor umbrella. People will question, well, if the record exists digitally or it's electronic, why does it need to be in the TMF? Why do I have to migrate it from my system to this TMF platform? Or if they are in, it's not the same vendor across those electronic platforms, they'll say, well, it exists electronically in this system. Why are we migrating? That's more work for me, right? So we've kind of created this adversarial kind of culture of, well, an electronic record's an electronic record, or I have it on my desktop and it's electronic. And so I think there has had to be more education around digital or electronic records and what that means, and the eTMF platform, and where the authoritative or auditable source is for that documentation. Because again, rightfully so, people are inquisitive. They question. I am guilty. I am one of those parties. I kind of like to ask, well, why? What's the logic here? And I think something that's important for us to kind of recognize as TMF professionals is we have to drive that culture of looking at an eTMF or the TMF as that single source of truth, so that we aren't having to go to 6 different platforms to try to reconcile completeness, right? If we're all working off of one index, how do we reconcile, what's filed where? Is everything filed? What does it look like from completeness and reporting? Now, instead of 1 report, you're looking at 4 reports. It can get very messy. So I think it has to start with us engaging with those other functional lines. But again, it comes back to process, right? If your process allows those functional lines to maintain those systems and not prioritize the TMF, you're already starting a losing battle, right? So people, it's funny. I laugh at this sometimes, that a lot of times people don't know the process, right? Like they'll say, oh, I didn't know I only had 30 days to do X, Y, and Z. But if it's something that favors them, they've got that process right in your face, right? Of like, oh, no, per my process, I have. So we have to make sure people really kind of understand that at the end of the day.
Well, I think you brought something up. You brought COVID up, right? And so if you're a sponsor and you only had paper documents and you weren't doing monitoring to sites during COVID, How did you know your TMF was accurate?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've seen a huge push since
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I was very busy during COVID.
Yeah.
Because
Mm-hmm.
those clients that maybe didn't touch their quality reviews for all those years are like, okay, now here you go, take them. And then you had a lot of people trying to, switch and migrate to an electronic system because they had no visibility
Mm-hmm.
to their
Yep.
TMF. We've got a scanning group, and we couldn't go into the office to scan the documents. So these clients that had started were racking their brains because they were like, well, I get that you can't go into the office, but what are we supposed to do? And we would be like, you sent it to us the day before we got shut down. What are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So yep. I think COVID has really opened eyes up to to sponsors specifically of maybe we should have our own TMF. Maybe we should have an EISF. I think you're starting to see the people go, maybe it'll make our lives a little easier.
I love it. Yeah. Sorry. I'm taking notes too. Cause like, as you say things, I'm like, I want to make sure we touch on this. I'm like jotting down as we go. Cause I think you and I think we just feed off of each other's energy so well and we make these comments. And so, for me, one thing that I did want to mention, just kind of from how we look at the TMF as well, and how we and this may be kind of a segue into changing culture perhaps, and where we want culture to be when it comes to the TMF. And it centers back to that point we talked about of, is the TMF just kind of a filing repository, right? Like, we know here's the documents, they're in this location, great, kind of set it and forget it. And for me, when I think about the culture of the TMF and what I try to get people on board with, like the brand of the TMF, the significance of the TMF, I really try to spend time educating folks on how the TMF is a reflection of everything that they've done. And I think that sometimes changes that mindset for people, that they're like, oh, the documents are just there. And if there's questions, they don't necessarily look at the risks with poor quality. And so what I tell them is that, that poor quality documentation, you may think, oh, it's trivial, right? It says page 1 of 2, but it's just a 1-page document. Oh, or I forgot this checkbox. Like, it's a minor problem, but it's a reflection of everything that we've done, right? These are the outputs of the SAE reports, the safety monitoring, the actual site monitoring, the oversight. And if that documentation is inadequate or incomplete, that raises doubts for auditors and inspectors, right? Of like, can you actually monitor a site, right? Like, when you go on, you can't complete a document, but you're expected to do like source data verification, or you're expected to review this safety material, but you can't check a box. And I know, some of you may be rolling your eyes at that, but
that's how deep it gets.
Yeah, it does.
You see something like, and I tell a story all the time, and I'll do it. I always have a red pen near me, right? And I was a startup specialist.
Okay.
I was the person that sat there with the reg packets, looking through them. I would send it back to the site if the protocol was spelled wrong.
Yeah.
If they spelled one of their sub-I's wrong, 1572 went back. And sites would get so mad at me. And I'd be like, here's the thing. If I'm not doing my due diligence and holding you accountable on quality, the new 1572, right? If you click in one of the new boxes, it automatically adds a page. But if you didn't mean to do that, you either have to start all over again, or you leave it in there and people will take it out. And then you look at that, and it's supposed to be 2 of 5 or 1 of 5, and then there's only 3 pages.
Yeah,
you got to leave those blanks in there. That's because they're going to go, if you can't take the time to ensure that your pages are there, that it's a good scan, that signatures are present, all that's doing is open the door for them to check all your other stuff.
Yep.
And to your point, right? If a case report form or a data management plan is wrong, or there's spelling errors, how do you know they're reviewing the data correctly? But you're definitely opening the door. So I'm sure, I agree with you. I'm sure there are people out there rolling their eyes, but listen, I'd rather have you roll your eyes at me now and take the extra time to make that check than be issued an audit finding. Yeah,
absolutely. And, again, it is those little things, right? And and with the TMF, in my experience, oftentimes it's not one major or critical thing that happens. It's a lot of these little cracks that eventually lead to bigger issues. And that's what auditors and inspectors pick up on, is this like, repetition of non-compliance versus just like one issue. Let's see what Sue said here. Likes to dig deep when I'm looking at a document and find any little mistake, because that little mistake can turn exactly kind of what we're talking about, right? This little crack that gets bigger. And I think that kind of maybe extends into the cultural comment here of between functional lines and like document reviewers or TMF professionals, that you're out to get us, you're looking for these little things, but that's our job, right? And kind of understanding the roles and responsibilities, that's part of culture. As to, you know, if Sue was to let everything go through and then there was an audit and inspection, well, Sue's going to get in trouble, right? Because, oh, they're supposed to be looking for these issues, they slip through the cracks. But if they don't follow up on that, then, you know, and functional lines for me, and maybe this leans into culture a little bit as well, you know, who is the accountable party, right? And I'm curious on your thoughts here. So, you know, to me, it depends, right? So metadata is a fascinating one for me. It's all dependent on like who enters the metadata, in my opinion, because if you have your functional lines entering metadata and they make a mistake, and you notice that as part of your review, you know, the conversation becomes, well, who should make the correction? You're the document reviewer, you see the mistake, just update it, don't send it back to me, right? Like, why are we going to waste that time? Why are we going to raise a quality issue? Because you see the issue, just take care of it. But from a cultural standpoint, we can't change behavior unless you're notified, right? And that's it's sometimes viewed as you're being picky, you're just doing this to like prove you're better than me, and it's like, it's not. I'm doing my job.
Right. Well, and it's funny because it kind of leans into one of the comments that came through. Somebody writes, I do not like it when we are letting the client know that something is not right, but I'm told that it's okay for them, right?
So
going to your point, right? You're the little things can be a little crack and it'll tear down the world when you think about it.
Yeah.
I personally feel, and this is my feeling, and I think I can speak for most of the TMF world, the document submitter, the document owner should be the one that fixes those issues.
Yeah.
Because if you're just ignoring the trends and ignoring the things, how do you better yourself through it? How do you ensure that you've got a complete TMF, an accurate TMF, right?
Yep.
All of the Alcoa principles, right? If you don't know that, if you're not doing your due diligence yourself, and we always say, you and I have said it on calls, I've said it with my colleague Jill and I, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. If you're not taking the time to learn from your mistakes to better yourself, you're never going to be inspection ready.
Right.
And you can't then say, oh, well, my service provider didn't tell me. Because I would almost guarantee that 9 times out of 10, they told you.
Yeah.
And you're just pushing it aside. So, you know, those little things, little bitty tiny things, as simple as they are, right?
Yeah.
Could bring down a mountain. So you've got to, there's always the accountability. You've got the person that your TMF owner. That's the person that's ultimately responsible for the quality of the TMF. However, your functional areas are responsible for their records and their information. They're the only ones that can tell the story for their zone or their documentation. I mean, I might be in ClinOps, I might know everything there is to know. I don't, but if I knew everything, maybe I don't know, but you have to hold those functional areas accountable for their documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, David mentioning here, it's okay for us. It's not the right way. One of the challenges, and kind of added there, if we keep doing things the wrong way, because that's how the client wants it, it kind of defeats that whole purpose of learning it the right way. To me, this may, again, be part of the conversation around culture of the TMF, is that there is a lot of ambiguity or vagueness when it comes to regulatory guidance, right? It really centers around quality, timeliness, completeness, right? Our kind of pillars for success. But I always kind of make the analogy that's like, we're all running, or we're all in a race, right? We've got to get 100 meters down the road. Somebody might have a bicycle, somebody may be walking, somebody may be in a wheelchair, somebody might have a jetpack, right? We have these different resources that we can use to get to this same goal. And so a lot of times there's not a right or wrong. Now, there are instances, to David's point, there are like wrong ways of like, oh, just ignore pagination, ignore, you know, it's not signed, we don't care, those little things, versus like, you know, oh, we want to file at location A, you tell us location B. Ultimately, as long as it's documented, usually they don't have an issue. So it's kind of understanding when to pick those battles, but also, again, holding each other accountable, creating that culture of, do you understand the responsibility of your role and
Mhm.
kind of my intention here? And I think one of the things that's challenging is that culture to me also is people look at the TMF as this burden, right? Because a
Yeah.
lot of times
Yeah.
we have created a negative connotation or negative culture around the TMF because when do you most commonly hear about it? Submit your documents on time. You have quality issues to resolve. We have an audit or inspection. You have audit
Mhm.
and inspection findings to respond to. These are all kind of perceived as negatives, right? Because it's work that I have to do.
Right.
So we have to kind of create a more positive culture. I think that's encouraging people when they do a good job. We often forget to do that because a lot of people say, well, compliance is expected. And I'm like, when it comes to the TMF, we kind of have to like hype it up a little bit more
Yeah.
because people only hear about it negatively. But I think we also have to recognize from a cultural standpoint that when we are asking people to make these changes, we perceive it as easy, right? Or like, you shouldn't have made this mistake. The document should have been signed. Yes, they should have done it correctly the first time, but it is our responsibility to kind of check that from a quality perspective. And it is going to take them time to perform that task,
Mhm.
right? A lot of times I don't expect someone to drop everything they're doing, make this change. And so I think we also have to recognize as TMF professionals what we are asking of our functional lines and
Mhm.
understand that they have other responsibilities as well. It's kind of that double-edged sword of like we want them to prioritize the TMF, but we have to recognize that they have other things that they're also doing, and we have to find that middle ground of what is the timeline here.
Well,
So I
it's
think
about setting expectations, right? Like
correct. Yep.
if you know it, and we've talked about it too, that have a TMF team. You've got your TMF owner, then you have
Hmm.
a TMF lead from whatever functional area. That lead from that, I always do it, and I always apologize. Sorry, data management. But let's say you have a data management lead that's in
Yeah.
there, right?
Yep.
And they say to you, well, the timeline you put together isn't feasible because of this
Hmm.
data lock, whatever, right?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
You have to be flexible to them. You can't
Yep.
just assume they're going to get it done. I do think it's funny. A comment, Sue, I completely understand it. Finding it hard when there's numerous vendors. They all hold different functional documents,
Hmm.
right? Setting expectations with each of those service providers, with your functional areas.
Yep.
Don't set crazy timelines. Set realistic timelines.
Yep.
Things that you can actually do.
Hmm.
Have touch points throughout the study. It doesn't have to be a full meeting. We always talk about office hours, right? As you're the study
Hmm.
owner, maybe somebody from regulatory has a question. They come in, they ask you the question. They know now what they have to do for their zone. Have that open door policy to ensure that the team gets it, but also be flexible because you
Yeah.
don't want to David's point, be professional. If you're setting those expectations, you're being professional.
Hmm.
You don't have to be mean. I mean, back in the
Yep.
day, we were mean, right?
Yeah.
If you didn't do this, we held you accountable.
Yeah.
I've heard, and I think you were with me, Ben, when we were in Boston, and one of my panelists was like, "Oh yeah, we sent out a newsletter on all of the issues, and they
Hmm.
called people out on it." That's mean, but the TMF ended up passing inspection, right? Because
Yeah.
it was
Shaming
all
kind of works in a
internal.
way.
Yeah, shame. But they've built that culture where you don't want to be the one that's called out in the newsletter.
Correct.
you,
Yeah.
you want to know
Mhm.
what you need to do, and I think that's pretty key is setting those expectations up front for sure.
Yeah, I love that. And also and I know Heidi sent a point, but I want to kind of touch on David's as well of
Mhm.
just like the professional way that we approach things. And I think one of the analogies that I have that I've seen in recent is like, especially here in the US healthcare system,
Mhm.
you have to advocate for yourself a lot of times to get a test ran or some kind of procedure. And so, if a doctor declines and you request like, okay, I want you to put in my chart that I requested this and you denied this for me, right? So you're
Mhm.
holding them accountable. And then all of a sudden they kind of listen and they're like, okay, maybe we'll run that panel that you were looking
Right.
for. We can kind of have that same thought here, right? Of, bringing this to their attention and saying, okay, like I understand we've brought this to your attention. Here's the communication. Here's the meeting notes. We're going to file this in the TMF because if this becomes an issue in the audit, in the inspection, we are not going to be responding, right? And I think that's one of the things, culturally people think whoever is taking ownership of the TMF, like whether it's the TMF management team, a vendor, they respond to all TMF related questions because they're the TMF people. But our culture needs to be accountability and appropriate accountability. So if you are telling them this is our recommendation or this needs to be corrected and they say no, we'll document that and inform them of that. Okay, great. As part of our oversight, we have informed you of this. You're saying no, we're going to file that as evidence of the TMF. Because your TMF and the cultural thing here is the TMF has to say what happened and what didn't happen. Right. And I think a lot of times we try to hide things that didn't go according to plan, right? We're like, oh, if we're asked about it, we'll have something in the background. I say the TMF is a book. And when you loan somebody a book, right? Like, oh my gosh, you need to read this like bestseller. I love this book. You don't expect them to get to a chapter, you ripped it out and kept it and say like, oh, you have to call me and I'll tell you all about this chapter. Same thing with the TMF. You hand it over, the things that went correctly are there. The things that you didn't do, that you missed, you also have to show your story of oversight. Like recognize we messed up. We're human. It's going to happen. But how are you documenting that? So that culture of maybe shame and being scared to like admit to faults, we've got to get out of that mindset because they're going to find it.
Yeah, they're going to find it. They're going to find it. And I think to your point too of don't hide anything, you know, and I think
it's going to get found.
It's going to get found. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I've been to multiple conferences where I've stood on the podium at a keynote speech and be like, all right, everybody here, raise your hand if your TMF is perfect.
Yeah.
Not one hand went up, right? We know they're not perfect, but can you tell the story of why they're not perfect?
Right.
That at the end of the day, if you found something, if you found a trend, I'm gonna pick on you, Ben. So Ben, you've uploaded 20 documents, right? 10 of them are wrong. There's no signature, they're scanned bad, whatever. I'm gonna hold you accountable to fix those. But I'm also gonna retrain you on the importance of that. I'm gonna document that of why these 20 or 10 documents were not up to standard and what did I do to fix it? Right? I'm going to create that process. So in the event that an inspector comes in and says, we noticed that this, and this happened. What did you do to resolve it? Right? It's all documented. Here you go. This is what I did. Because if I just say, well, we had a meeting, we identified that, we retrained it, they're all going to laugh in our face. Right? Because they don't believe that we did it. They don't believe that we had the oversight. So you've got to build a culture, and I laugh when I say it, but you got to build a culture that the TMF is never going to be perfect. Get it to the best possible standard you can and know the story, know the rationale, and understand where you can improve and move forward. Inspectors like to see that you've made a shift. If something wasn't working, they want to see that shift and how did it end up turning out?
Yeah. And I think that's something you bring up. I actually was taking it. I said, if we can't be perfect, why bother? Question mark. Right. And I think you're just talking about that. And I think that's kind of the mindset. And we talk about this in TMF University, one of the programs we offer at LMK, you know, that there is this kind of weird perception, I think, from executive leadership, not to throw the executives under the bus here. I also am guilty, Laurel, of I always use data management as my example. But with the executives
we love you, data managers. We love
you. Executives expect perfection, right? When it comes to the team, if they want to avoid minor major findings, of course, right? But when they look at, you know, KPIs, for example, and that drives culture. When you expect 100% quality, I'm like, okay, you know, I actually had one of my goals years ago was 100% was meets expectations. So if a scale from 1 to 5, it was a 3. And I was like, so I can never exceed because I cannot do better than 100%. So I was saying, if I make one mistake by this metric, if I make one mistake of a task that I do thousands of times, I am not meeting expectations. Right. And that sets us up for kind of poor morale and poor culture. And we do have to accept that perfection isn't quite possible when it comes to the TMF. And I think regulatory agencies understand that, right? That it's what we've just been talking about. How do we document what didn't go correctly and demonstrating that oversight? Now, there's certain, you know, deviations, so to speak, that are easier to address and probably less offensive to auditors and inspectors versus, you know, some major deviations that might happen. But we have to understand that people are going to make mistakes. Machines are also going to make mistakes with AI, right?
Yeah,
with
they are.
Indexing sequencing, auto naming configuration, things are going to go wrong. So it's how we respond. But if your organization is creating a culture of perfection or even the pursuit of perfection when it comes to the TMF, you're going to create fear for everyone doing any task. They're going to be slower, which, sometimes that can help with quality, but they're going to be spending, instead of looking at a document like a medical license, for example, you could probably review that in a minute or so. Instead of taking a minute, they're going to take 5 minutes because they're going to look to say, oh, is the background like a little bit smudged? Is this? We don't want to instill fear in people by requiring perfection. We want to empower them to say, okay, when you make a mistake, do you know how to respond? Do we have the toolkits, the resources in our organization to give you, a note to file or a communication or an escalation pathway to address what didn't go correctly? I think that builds a more positive culture. Now, again, it's a balance, right? Because I always have to say that doesn't mean we say just do whatever the heck you want, make all the mistakes you want. We can just fix them with the file note. That's not the right mindset either. It's the balance of we try our best every day. When we notice something didn't go well, what's the appropriate due diligence to perform and how do we correct it? Sorry to go on there.
One of the things that I created when I was on the sponsor side, and we've kind of embraced it now on a consulting side at with Trial Interactive, is checklists. I know they're manual, whatever, but as being old school, I want to know what to look at. So one of the things I created way back when was a guide on what to look for. So every document you look for A, B, and C.
Yeah.
Now for the essential documents for 1572, what are you looking for in each box? What are you cross-referencing? Right. And so having that tool in place, you're still going to make mistakes, but at least you have a starting point of what your best practice should be. Right. And I think having tools like that, or just having that mindset of, cross-referencing documents, like specifically at 1572, right? You're going to cross-reference the financial disclosure, a CV, a medical license. Does that all work in there? You're then going to look at the CV and you're going to look for the affiliation of the addresses, right? And if you don't know to look for that, that's where your mistakes are going to be.
Yeah.
So having some sort of, hey, this is what I need you to look at, specifically at startup, then you've got that focus and you can build off of it.
Yeah, I love that. How do we support one another? I think it centers back to like collaboration, competency, things that we've talked about this week that, when we tell people to do tasks when it comes to the TMF, right? Your culture can't be that, oh, people should know, right? Like when I tell you to look for quality or do a cross check, we don't want somebody to say, oh, I think it's this, right? I often say when it comes to, creating TMF expectations, you don't want people to have questions when they read a process like, oh, go do a gap analysis. And they're like, okay, I think I know what that is. Or, do this 1572 cross check. Is everything filed? Are they also looking at the lab documents, the IRB documents, things like that? So we've got some people making some comments here. They do a 7-point check with every document, living by doing those cross checks. I think that is very important. One thing I think we've kind of mentioned this is, looking to improve, looking to get better. And I think this also lends to that culture of pursuit of perfection. This is something that we may have differing opinions here. I'm curious to see what you think. This, pursuit of continuous improvement, right? We always want to do things faster, more efficiently, increase our quality. But do you think that creates a positive cultural change when it comes to the TMF, or do you think it could create maybe negative? What are you seeing there in like changing processes, implementing things to be faster, better quality, those things?
So let me start by asking you a question.
Go for it.
How much do you like process change?
Yeah, it depends. I'm one of those people. I'm the skeptic. I like to ask the whys we're doing these things. I accept change. I embrace change, of course. I'm vocal, if I feel like I'm the expert in the area, and it depends on where's this change coming from, right? Like if somebody's like, oh, the standard's 20 documents an hour for efficiency's sake, we want to cut it in half to 10. And I'm like, who's making this decision? How are we all of a sudden going to work twice as fast? So there's a lot of factors, but I like it. And
I think for me, I don't think I've ever enjoyed I don't like change in general.
Fair.
But it goes to evolution. Right. And you have to accept change. But I think it comes down to the messaging. How are you messaging that change? Are you just saying, we're doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Don't do that. You're never going to get anybody to buy in.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make this change based on this, for this reason. And it's not going to be an instant change. It's going to be a change
Mm-hmm.
that we kind of phase in, right?
Yep.
Don't be, and I'll pick on E6 real quick. How many
Yep.
people have we heard say, well, I don't have time to make all these changes? You're not being asked to make all these changes right now. You're being asked to phase them in. We're guiding you. Like I
Yep.
don't know if you've done it, Ben, but on our side, I've taken all of my consulting documents and already switched it to, it's no longer documents, it's records.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
no
we're doing
longer
that in our
vendors, it's
materials.
service providers, right? So,
Yeah.
but that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Our system still says documents.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a phased in approach. So any changes like that, anything big you have like that, phase it in. Pick up a test group, like a small study, and test
Mm-hmm.
out the process. Does it work for you? Is the culture working? Is the engagement working? And then go to a second or third study, right?
Yep.
And get the feedback. Every time you do it, get your lessons learned and build it into the next one, right?
Yep.
And at the end of the day, you're going to be set up for success. You're not setting yourself up for massive failure, because at the end of the day, I have seen clients go full bore. I'm making all these changes I'm doing right now. And they call us back 3 months later and go, oh my God, please help us. We're drowning. Right?
Yeah.
Because they jumped into the deep end without knowing what they needed to do. So you've got to have an approach. But again, at the end of the day, change is change. It's about evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I guarantee in 10 years, the TMF is going to look totally different than it does now.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe even 5 years. Maybe not even go 10 years. But you've got to be ready for that change. And doing it in a phased approach, I think, is going to be easier for you and cause less stress for you and your team, because you want to keep that team engaged.
Yeah.
And if you're just throwing them in the deep end, you're not going to have much engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even those little things like the nuances in language, right? From documents to records, or patients to subjects to participants, vendors, service providers. And those little things, I tell people, don't really get hung up on that. Like, the nuances of language, a lot of times it's more so like the requirements of actions that we have to perform. And, for me, process improvement, again, centers around this pursuit of perfection, right? And so, again, quality of the TMF is the expectation is that all documents or all records that are filed meet the appropriate quality standards, right? So there's not really, it's not allowable to say like, oh, you can file a certain amount of documents that have quality issues, right?
Right.
But we know based off of audits and inspection and historical industry performance that a couple of mistakes here and there aren't going to result in a huge delay in the trial, right? Or halt of study activity. So when I talk to organizations of, we want to, instead of the KPI for document review being 20 an hour, we want to change it down to 12 an hour. And it's like, well, what's driving that? Well, we want to be more efficient. We want to have less resourcing. We want to be able to, file more documents. But I'm like, do you understand, like, how does that happen, right? Like, you're like, oh, well, we have eTMF now. And I'm like, okay, well, in eTMF, there's metadata. That didn't exist in paper, right? So there's these other things. Well, now there's AI that can enter metadata. And I'm like, well, is it still perfect? I'm like, does your phone work correctly every single day? How often do you get mad at technology? I say, look at Outlook. For those of us that still have to use that, when you search for a document in Outlook, does it ever come up? 90% of the time, no. So technology can fail us. And so I tell people, this constant pursuit of perfection or improvement can also create a negative culture in the TMF space, because if you're always driving change, you're never satisfied with where you are. And sometimes where you are is good enough. You don't get extra credit for being, filing documents in 19 days versus 18 days, right? In the eyes of regulatory agencies, they're not going to really see a big difference there. Now, 85 days and 12 days, they'll probably have some opinions. But these little changes that people try to make, I'm like, is it really worth it? What is the benefit here other than just kind of being a little bit faster?
Right.
And I think the other thing that you mentioned is kind of addressing the why for people, and defining what this change actually is and empowering people through change. Because instead of just saying, oh, this is the action, this is what's going to be done, explaining why you made that decision. So again, document owners, why were you selected to do the content review of the document? Well, you actually went on the visit, right? CRA. So you know that the content of this document is accurate. So in an audit or an inspection, if they ask about, hey, during this visit, it says X, Y, and Z happened, do you want the TMF manager answering that or you? Now, I know there's some smart Alex out there that'll say, well, of course, the TMF manager, I don't want to answer anything. But most people recognize when you break it down for them, why they're the ones doing what they're supposed to do. So Just want to see here. I know we've had a lot of stuff come in. I think we've caught up to most of the comments here, and I know we just have a couple of minutes left. So I do want to be mindful of that. If there are any last minute thoughts, questions, I have appreciated the amount of engagement. And I always joke, I love things like these or industry conferences because it allows us to commiserate together a little bit. Like we all have the same problems, and it is sometimes a challenge. It's like, when are we going to get over that hump and get to the green pastures and the green acres there? But let's see here. If your teams are commonly learning, adjusting to process the system and changes, they'll never have time to effectively manage the TMF. Exactly right. Change happens. And I think that is something we need to embrace, that sometimes we're forced to make a change, whether that's, we're decommissioning a system, there's been a regulatory, the change, those can actually be absolute drivers for why we're doing it. But if we're just kind of constantly trying to find the next big thing, we're never going to get comfortable. We're never going to be complacent. And I don't even want to start the conversation on migrations, because that's a whole thing in and of itself with change. I like that you've kind of made that point, Heidi. And I think that's something that people need to recognize, that change is scary. Change is inevitable. It sometimes needs to happen, but it's always, maybe you have a culture around change. Like, why are we making this decision? Is it strictly to save a little time, save a little money? Is it actually going to be a long-term benefit for us, right? Is this going to stress people out? Are we going to turn over? That's going to lose money, right? At the end of the day. But as we're kind of wrapping up here, Laurel, any kind of final things that you want to share? Like, you said, the TMF might look very different in 5 to 10 years. Any words of wisdom, things you want to share with folks before we kind of sign off for Career Week?
I think the big thing, and going back to your point just for a quick second, is you're going to have situations where change is inevitable and you have to change immediately. That's a critical reason to make a change. Phase in everything else, right? Now, talking about what's, evolution. AI is a big thing. Big thing. I was a skeptic. I was not thrilled the last 3 years of everybody bringing it up. I'm like, shut up. Please don't say it. Don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. I was really concerned that was going to take away my job. Until AI is perfected, right? Because it's in a system. You're always going to need a personal element. And I think you need to remember that. AI doesn't always spell things correctly. AI doesn't always put A to B and B to C, right? So you're still going to have to do those checks. Don't ignore it. Start embracing it. Start embracing the change. Because if you don't, you're going to be kind of like me, a 24-year-old TMF veteran that still likes paper, right? So you want to make sure that you embrace those changes and you can grow with it and build off of those lessons learned. Any hiccups you have, build off of it. Don't just, I'll fix it later. Embrace it and fix it. And I think at the end of the day, people, you said it earlier, it's just TMF. Nobody really cares. TMF is your story. TMF is really not just the story of your study, but it's the story of where you've come from start to finish. And it might be good story, it might be a bad story. Build lessons learned as you go through. And identify those gaps in your change and the culture and everything, and just engage your team, ask for help, ask questions, have office hours, whatever you need to do to build that team collaboration.
I love that. And I think, for me, the conversation really centers around all of us can drive culture within our organizations. You don't have to be an executive, the decision maker, a manager, a director. You can be those individual contributors that, shares your opinion. Oftentimes the people doing the work day to day provide the best feedback, right? Of like, this won't work. This isn't working. That's how, you'll inevitably get to where you want to go. So don't be afraid to speak up, be that lifelong learner that kind of Laurel was mentioning there, that, AI is coming, right? But again, technology makes mistakes. Even with AI, we as humans are driving the use of that AI, and machine learning is a very real thing, but somebody's configuring something somewhere in the background, right? And kind of telling this computer what needs to happen. So having oversight of that, kind of understanding what roles might look like. 20 years ago, we were just reviewing documents. Now we have system admin roles. We're doing configuration of document naming. We're granting access to systems. We're managing access lists. The role has expanded almost exponentially, right? From what it was 20 years ago when you're just kind of looked at, please file this document.
Right.
Now it's like, oh, can you run this report? Can you analyze this report? Can you grant access? Can you reconfigure this? Can you move this document? There's so many things that happen there. So again, anybody can drive change. Thanks, Isaiah. I was going to respond as we're wrapping up here. Yes, the video will be available on LinkedIn, so anybody can join it, or not join it, watch it later through the LMK page. So feel free to kind of log in there. You may have to register still to get access. So when you click on it, it may ask you to register to be able to view later. But the content will be available for everyone. But I do appreciate the engagement here. You know, for those joining, we've mentioned TMF University and other offerings. One thing that I like to mention is, you know, from a cultural aspect, is to be that lifelong learner, to stay engaged, what's happening. So these free events that we host, webinars, I know you probably are sick of seeing Laurel and I on, you know, Transperfect, Trial Interactive, LMK pages, but that's what we're here for, is to drive the change, stay engaged. So we're excited to see folks, you know, having these comments. And thanks, Sue, for saying a great TMF week. You know, we want to keep having these each year, but we'll remain engaged throughout the year as well. But Laurel, a big thanks to you. I always enjoy these sessions, you know, going back and forth here. I think we could talk for hours and hours.
We totally could.
Yeah, we'll spare the folks. But if you do have questions about, you know, services we provide, TMF University, if you're curious about that, reach out. You know, e-learning offerings that we have, or just kind of want, you know, some consulting, right, to bounce ideas off. That's what we're here for. We really want to make sure people feel supported. But just thanks for a great career week. To wrap things up, really excited to see familiar folks each day. That really is meaningful to me, to see that you see the value each day, taking an hour out of your time to kind of listen to us yap. But thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great weekend. Remain engaged. If you have questions, reach out to us, and, you know, LinkedIn, websites, whatever that might be. We're happy to support you. But yeah, I'll see you next year at our 3rd annual career week, and then any other engagements we have throughout the year. But thanks again, Laurel, and bye, everyone.
Yep. Bye, everybody.